So welcome to the final session of today's education, network neuroscience education workshop. In the final session, we're going to have two presentations. They're both virtual presentations. The first will be from Rick Betzel, and Rick will give an overview on community structure and detecting modules in brain networks. And following Rick's presentation, we'll then hear from Petra Ritter, our second Petra in the course, and Petra will introduce the virtual brain, which is a simulation workflow for simulating brain dynamics. So let's start with Rick Betzel on modularity.
So I just want to say thanks for inviting me to give the next talk on detecting modules and communities in brain networks. I'm going to hop right in without any pause. So the kinds of analyses that we typically carry out with brain network data oftentimes focus on properties of individual brain regions or connections themselves. These local measures might be as simple as just counting up the number of connections that a node makes, its degree, or its centrality with respect to some process unfolding over the network. On the other hand, we might be interested in properties that characterize the network as a whole. So, on average, the number of steps it takes to go from one node to another, the network's path length, or the reciprocal of those shortest paths and their average efficiency. Situated between these two extremes, this local and global scale, there's a rich meso-scale that doesn't focus on properties of nodes or the whole network, but on clusters or subnetworks. And we call these subnetworks modules or communities, and the set of all communities constitutes a partition of the network. Why are we interested in studying mesoscale structure? Well, on one hand, by studying mesoscale structure, we are effectively doing dimension reduction. Rather than focusing on properties of individual nodes or edges, we can focus on properties of modules. Modules, and when we discover them in networks, it allows us to say something about functional relationships between the nodes and the module. Many studies have established that the modules have a clear functional correspondence, that those nodes that make up the same module tend to be functionally related to one another, so we can try to better understand the function of the networks that we study. If we know a network's modules, we can also use them to diagnose and detect hubs in the network. For instance, connector hubs that sit at the boundary of many different modules, or provincial hubs that make lots of connections to one or a few modules. And importantly, we can apply tools for characterizing and detecting and studying modules equally well to functional and structural connectivity. And then for those of you interested, you can also study individual variation in this mesoscale or community structure. But we're left with a big challenge in most cases. You put somebody in the scanner, you acquire some data, you build your network. What are its modules, right? When we encounter a new network, it's not always obvious whether our network has modular structure, and if so, what those modules correspond to. And in general, with the exception of trivially small networks, that detecting or characterizing or even knowing if a network has a scale structure, we can't do this based on visual inspection alone, right? So here's an adjacency matrix for a network. If you were to stare at it, like we are right now, you would not recognize that nested inside of this network, its rows and columns can be reordered to reveal very clear block modules. So we can't assess whether a network has modules based on visual inspection alone. We need something better. We need algorithmic tools and quantitative tools. This is a practice referred to as community or module detection. There are lots of algorithms. There are lots of criteria for defining and detecting communities, and the user has lots of control over it. In most cases, detecting the truly optimal communities is computationally intractable, so we resort to heuristics. And all of the common tools are sensitive to parameters. That is, we have to make some decisions, parameterize them in specific ways. If you're using a tool that claims it does not have parameters, it is lying. There's some implicit parameters baked into it that you may not have access to in your implementation. So the rest of the talk, I want to walk through the procedure for detecting modules in brain networks. I'll introduce the modularity function, which we will discuss at length. I will show you an example where we apply it to structural connectivity data. And then I'll talk about how to extend modularity to multi-layer networks, and finish with a short application to time-varying functional connectivity. And then I'll end with one slide on some additional reading and some caveats to what we're working on. Just as a disclaimer, the goal here is not to give you a definitive roadmap for how to do community detection. There's lots of ways of doing it. It's more of an art in some sense than a rigidly defined right or wrong path. Rather, my goal is to convince you that one, community detection is a challenging and difficult process. As a user, you must make lots of decisions along the way. While these decisions can feel paralyzing at times and make the process of community detection challenging, it also allows the methods to be flexible and capable of accommodating many different research questions. So I'm just going to hop right in now to the first part where we talk about modularity and apply it to structural connectivity data. So as I said before, there are many algorithms for detecting communities. There is, of course, Infomap, which is popular in network neuroscience. This is based on clustering the probabilistic flow of random walkers over the network. Communities correspond to groups of nodes that effectively trap the walker. Methods like clique percolation, on the other hand, are based on overlapping maximal cliques. There are methods that define communities at the level of edges, for example, YY-ONS link communities. And there are inferential methods like stochastic block models. So there are lots of tools out there. This is an old screen capture, but perhaps the most common of those tools is modularity maximization. This is an old method. I said this is an old capture from 2018. At the time, the paper that introduced this method from Mark Newman and Michel Gervan had 10,000 citations. That is something closer to 20,000 now. But you can go look this up. It's a wonderful paper and it spawned a lot of research, obviously. So modularity maximization, what is it? Well, it works on this eminently simple principle. It defines communities to be groups of nodes in your network that are more densely connected to one another in the real network than we would expect by chance. I'll illustrate this here to try to give you some intuition. Suppose we had some real network. I'm going to call it A. This is a structural connectivity matrix, by the way. Red colors indicate very strong connections. White colors indicate the absence or weak connections. This is our observed network. Now, if we had some null model that could give rise to chance or random versions of our networks that preserve some subset of properties of the original, but where connections are otherwise formed by chance or stochastically, if we simulated that model an infinite number of times, we could calculate the expected weights of connections or presence of connections under that null model. I'm going to call this matrix P. So we have what we see in the real data, what we'd expect by chance. Modularity works by defining a matrix. I'm going to call it a B that is literally the element-wise subtraction of these two matrices. Let's take what we see minus what we expect. That's this B matrix. We call this the modularity matrix. What modularity maximization tries to do, it tries to define communities, that is, assign every node to a cluster such that the within cluster elements of this modularity matrix tend to be positive. That is, the connections that fall within communities are stronger than expected. So on the left, the blocks indicate nodes assigned to the same community. Here, This first community has some red elements, but also some blue. So it means that some of the connections that fall within that community are bigger than expected, but others are much weaker than expected. In contrast, a high quality partition concentrates lots of positive elements within communities. We see lots of red concentrated within communities that would constitute a high quality partition. I'm promising you, I'm not going to show you very many equations, but this one is worth looking at. So what modularity maximization is actually trying to do is trying to make this Q function, this quality function Q, as big as possible by choosing community assignments. Again, Q is a measurement of quality. In general, bigger values indicate better communities. A, in this case, Aij, this is the observed weight of the connection between node I and j. Pij is the expected weight of the connection between those same nodes. Gi and Gj are the cluster assignments or the community assignments of nodes I and j respectively. And this delta function is the Kronecker delta, and it is equal to 1 if Gi and Gj are equal to one another, and otherwise is equal to 0. So what modularity maximization is essentially trying to do is it's trying to choose the values, choose these cluster assignments, such that when we do the summation over all pairs of nodes, all ij's, the elements that fall within communities, Gi and Gj are identical and equal to 1. That sum is as big as possible. And again, this final value, this within community sum of edge weights, it basically tells us how good any partition is. Bigger values constitute better partitions. So the goal, of course, is to choose community assignments such that Q is as big as possible. There are lots of tools, lots of ways of doing so. I won't dwell on any of the particular algorithms, but suffice to say there are many. And of those, the Lavon algorithm is perhaps the best known. It is fast and it is relatively accurate on benchmarks. It is a multi-stage, greedy algorithm. Essentially what it does, it starts with every node in its own community. That is, every node is a singleton community. Communities are randomly merged, and mergers are accepted if they result in an increase in the modularity. So assigning 2 nodes to the same community produces an increase in Q. That merger is retained. This initial stage is repeated until no single node mergers can improve Q any further. At that point, we have some community assignments now. Generally, nodes are not singletons any longer. And we build a meta network through this community aggregation step where all of the red nodes are now condensed into a single red meta node. The green nodes assigned to the green community become their own meta node, and so on. And the process repeats until no additional aggregations yield improved Q values. And this, it continues indefinitely and until, again, no mergers can improve Q further. You'll notice here on the side, by the way, I have some .m functions in Courier script. These are functions in the brain connectivity toolbox. Some of you may know, occasionally we have some other functions from other toolboxes, but these functions implement whatever topic, whatever method or tool we're talking about. So you can go to the brain connectivity toolbox and use the community Lavon function to implement the Lavon algorithm. Okay, so let's try applying this to structural connectivity data. So I'm taking my network from before, just a better color map now. It's not reds and whites. So we have our network, we have our quality function, the modularity, and we have an algorithm for optimizing modularity. So this is the process. This is the general steps that you would take to optimize modularity and detect communities. Remember, in our modularity function, there are multiple components. We have that observed network A. The community assignments is what we're trying to detect, we're trying to discover. But there's this kind of complicated or a bit opaque term, the expected weight of the connections. It's based on a null connectivity model. And we're left with this question of how do we choose our null connectivity model? Is there a right or wrong answer? Is there some models that we should avoid? As you might imagine, this is a non-trivial decision. Our choice here impacts this inner term, the subtraction of the observed minus the expected, so it can impact the communities, right? It's determining which of the connections are expected or unexpectedly strong. And this is a case where I would argue that there is no true correct null model. Rather, it depends on the question and the context in which the algorithm is being applied. So a few possible null models. One is where we assume all connections are uniformly and randomly made. This is consistent with the Erdős-Rényi model. And so I'm showing you here the null matrix, the P matrix and its weights. And in this model, the expected weight of every connection is uniform. Other null models try to preserve other features of the network. For example, the configuration or Neumann-Garvan model generates random networks with the exact same degree and strength sequence as your observed network, but where connections are formed random. This is used it's probably the most common null model. It's often applied to functional connectivity data, but really should not. It assumes that all of the connections are formed independently, which is generally not true of our functional connectivity data, which are oftentimes determined on the basis of correlations or some other statistical property, statistical measure that has transitive properties. But nonetheless, it's still the most common. Other possibilities, of course, are to preserve other features of the network, like its spatial embedding. There are lots of different flavors that we could consider, but for our purposes and for the rest of this tutorial and workshop, I'll consider this particular null model, the Neumann-Garvan model. Okay, so let's say we settled on that model, we run the Louvain algorithm, and we get something that looks like this. Here's our network. Next to it are the community assignments of every node. The color indicates the community to which they're assigned. So there's a dark blue, a cyan, a yellow, and a red community. There's 4 of them. And the modularity quality of this partition is a value of 0.4. When we rearrange our network based on the communities, we rearrange the rows and columns, well, our communities look awfully blocky. The connections are concentrated within communities versus between. So we pat ourselves in the back and we're happy with our outcomes. Surely we're done, right? Well, imagine you closed your workstation, you turned it off, you come back the next day, you rerun the same simulation, you rerun the same Louvain algorithm with the exact same null model and the exact same network. Maybe you get a modularity function called Q2 that is, for all intents and purposes, identical to Q1. You look at the community assignments, at a glance, they don't look that different. And surprisingly, however, they are not identical. We don't see the same modules here any longer. So what gives? Why are we getting 2 dissimilar solutions, even though they have similar Q values? This is partly because the Louvain algorithm is non-deterministic. So different initial conditions will produce different partitions in general. But it is also due to what we call the near degeneracy of the modularity landscape. Imagine if you were able to detect the true, the absolute best partition, one with the biggest value of Q, one associated with the biggest value of Q. Now imagine you were to take one of the nodes that's in its true community assignment and just flip it, assign it to a new community at random. Well, you'll still probably have a very good partition. It's just one that's a little bit suboptimal. You could do the same thing, by the way, for every node to every community. You could do the exact same thing for every pair of nodes, every 2 nodes, switch them to different communities. And you'll still generally end up with good partitions. At some point when you reassign nodes to random communities, eventually you drop Q a lot. But for small perturbations, the partition results in a very, very high value of Q. So there are many near optimal solutions, all of them with comparable quality. This presents a problem, right? So how do we resolve this, this potential issue? And again, I'm illustrating what would happen if we were to run our algorithm, say 1,000 times. You can see some of the variability in here. Each column corresponds to a run. The colors indicate the community assignments. One way to express this variability and to quantify it is by computing a community allegiance matrix or a co-assignment matrix. In this matrix, we calculate for every pair of communities out of those 1,000 runs, how often were they assigned to the same community. So we see some regularities. The hot spots, the bright yellow elements, those are pairs of nodes that were consistently assigned to the same community. The black elements, those are nodes that were never co-assigned. But it is not black and white. It is not, we do not have consistency or consensus across these 1,000 runs. There is variability. How do we resolve this? One strategy for doing so is to cluster our community allegiance or co-assignment matrices directly. This is a process called consensus clustering, and it can be performed using modularity maximization. Essentially, what we're going to do is try and find groups of nodes whose community allegiance to one another is stronger than expected. This is a modularity problem, so we can take our observed allegiance matrix. We can do something maybe as simple as permuting nodes module assignments and computing a new expected allegiance matrix. Our permutation, of course, could be uniform and random, but they could also be done on the basis of spin tests that preserve spatial relationships approximately between nodes. But it would give us an expected allegiance matrix. We can calculate a new consensus modularity matrix as the observed allegiance minus the expected, and then cluster this directly. We can do this many, many times. And in general, what you'll find is that however much variability there was in the raw data, with the initial observed matrix, when you cluster the observed allegiance matrix, the variability is reduced. And in fact, oftentimes it'll be 0. That is, every solution converges, or every run converges to the same solution. And this can be implemented in the brain connectivity toolbox using the consensus undirected function. Okay, so now we've solved that problem. We have consensus communities. Surely we must be done with our modularity maximization. Well, not so fast. Modularity maximization has what is called a resolution limit, and so does other well-known and widely used community detection tools, incidentally. And what this resolution limit states is that if there are small communities in your network, even if they are unambiguously defined, they may not be detectable under certain conditions. And so what I mean by this is, imagine we have a network that looks something like this, a bunch of fully connected cliques, barely connected to one another. The expectation is that if we were to run modularity maximization on this, we would detect as communities each of the cliques. However, for certain sized networks, we will find that this is not the case. Adjacent cliques can get co-assigned into the same community, defying our expectation. What this means is that the modules we detect with modularity maximization may not reflect the true intrinsic community structure of our networks. We have a blind spot. So how do we address this potential blind spot? One strategy for doing so is to modify our modularity equation directly. We essentially will add an additional parameter that we'll call a structural resolution parameter. So here on the left is our original modularity equation. What we're going to do, we're going to add a gamma, and this gamma is multiplied by the expected weights of connections. So it essentially scales the importance of the null model. For small values of gamma, the communities that we detect, it's actually, before I do that, I'm showing you some of the modularity matrices for different gamma values at 0.2, at 1, at 1.8, at 2.6. Essentially, what we're doing is we increase gamma. We're making it more and more difficult for the observed connections to exceed that of our null models. As gamma gets bigger, that null model matters more. So you have to be really, really strong. The observed connection has to be really, really strong to exceed in the null model when gamma is 2.6. On the other hand, when gamma is about 0.2 or so, Many connections exceed the null model. As a consequence, the communities we detect, the number and size will depend on that value of gamma. If gamma is small, we get very coarse communities. As we increase gamma, the number and size of communities will vary. Specifically, the number will increase and the size of communities will drop off. There are lots of strategies for trying to choose the value of gamma. Some are based on, for example, heuristics. So we choose the gamma that optimizes some other meta objective function. We try to cross-validate two independent data sets. Or alternatively, and this is a strategy I try to embrace in my own work, is to embrace the fundamental multi-scale nature of communities and brain networks. Brain networks are not single-scale networks. They have big communities within which are smaller nested communities, and varying the gamma value can essentially give us access to these different scales. And the last point that I'll make is that the value of gamma equals 1. It is not a special value. Gamma equals 1 is for some implementations of modularity maximization, a kind of default setting. You should always explore variation in gamma and how it impacts your detected communities. Okay, so let's say at this point we are pretty comfortable with the communities that we've detected. What can we do with them? Well, one strategy, one follow-up analysis is to use the communities in our adjacency matrix to identify hubs in our network. And we do this with the measures, the within module degree z-score and participation coefficient. So here, kappa I corresponds to the degree or strength of connections a node makes to its own community. And the kappa I hat is the mean within module degree of all nodes in the same community. And below that is the variance, the standard deviation. So essentially we're calculating a z-score and it's telling us relative to the other nodes in the same community, how better connected is node I. We can do something similar with the participation coefficient and complementary. It is calculating the weights of connections that a node makes to any community, G divided by its total degree or total strength. And essentially what participation coefficient then calculates gives us a value of 1 if a node's if its connections are more or less uniformly distributed across communities, and a value close to 0 if its connections are concentrated within a very small number of communities. Given those two values, we can position any node in the network within this two-dimensional parameter space, which has been conveniently carved into distinct regions based on the Guimaraes-Amaral paper from 2004. Nodes that have high within module degree scores, we would consider them hubs, and everything else peripheral. The hubs themselves can be subdivided into provincial or connector hubs on the basis of their participation coefficient, and to build some intuition for what those would look like. You know, a connector hub would sit at the boundary of multiple modules and maintain connections to different modules, whereas a provincial hub sits atop its own module and makes connections to other nodes in the same module. And there's other classes of hubs too, including kinless hubs that don't really have a clear community assignment. So a really fast interim summary, there are many tools available for studying meso-scale structure. The modularity function is a way of judging how good or bad a partition is. In general, bigger values of Q correspond to internally dense and externally sparse communities. Maximizing Q is a computationally challenging problem, so we resort to heuristics like the Levan algorithm, and it forces us, anytime we try to optimize Q, it forces us to consider and make certain decisions, including the choice of null connectivity model, dealing with the non-deterministic nature of our optimization algorithm, so the fact that there's variability across repeated runs, the near degeneracy of partitions in our landscape of solutions, and the scale at which the modules get detected. All of these are issues that are associated with what we're going to see is called single layer modularity maximization. So I want to hop into the second part of this talk then, a brief extension to so-called multi-layer networks. And I'll talk about how to apply modularity maximization to time-varying functional connectivity. So, as I said before, modularity maximization is based on this eminently simple principle of comparing what we see versus what we expect. And the way I described it previously, it only works for what we call single layer networks. But there are lots of examples in the neuroscience and psychology, biology literature, where connectivity information is not easily encoded in a single layer, but is actually distributed across different layers. Some of the good examples in human neuroimaging and cognitive neuroscience include so-called time-varying connectivity, right? So I could calculate a network based on the correlation or covariance structure within a particular window, T1, a different network at T2, at window T3 and T4. So these would correspond to 4 different layers of connectivity. There's lots of papers that have examined time-varying connectivity and use multi-layer approaches to study it. The layers could also correspond to different association modalities. What I mean by that is we could talk about how strongly 2 nodes are connected functionally, structurally, or on the basis of the similarity of their transcriptome profiles or gene co-expression. So there are 3 different layers that encode different connectivity modalities. The layers themselves could correspond to different individuals. So we could have a layer per subject, in fact. So there are lots of cases, this is just a subset of the possibilities, but lots of cases where connectivity information is not concentrated in a single layer, but is distributed across many. Now, what we would like to do, ideally, is be able to track variation in communities across different layers. And naively, we might try to cluster them independently, that is, apply modularity maximization to each layer and then compare. Or alternatively, we could average layers together. Neither of these strategies are particularly satisfying. Averaging layers always results in information loss and occasionally means combining layers of different connectivity modalities, which is not super realistic. And in general, mapping communities from one network to another isn't always as straightforward as it seems. In fact, can result in some cases where the mapping is fundamentally ambiguous. That is, it's not obvious how 2 communities would correspond to one another. But thankfully, we can use those same modularity maximization tools to rescue us. How might this work? Well, we can build what is called a multi-layer modularity matrix and optimize it using our familiar algorithms. So I'll give you an example here for how to do this. So suppose we had 4 time-varying networks, and we calculated for each of them its own modularity matrix. So for this network, we have its observed minus expected. For the second network, could be a different subject or the same brain at a different time point. We have its own modularity matrix we'll call B2 and B3 and B4 for the other layers. If we want to build a multi-layer modularity matrix or multi-layer tensor, we could flatten this tensor and along its diagonal, place each of the each of the individual layers modularity matrices, so like this. If we were to run modularity maximization on this multi-layer modularity matrix as is, it turns out that it's exactly equivalent to clustering each of the matrices independently. And that's because they're not interacting with one another. All of the off-diagonal blocks of this matrix contain 0 entries. So there's, from the perspective of modularity maximization algorithm, there's no advantage, there's no benefit to merging communities from one layer to the next. On the other hand, if we were to add small interlayer coupling, identity links, linking one node in, let's say, layer 1 to itself in layer 2. This creates dependencies between the different layers, right? So there's different ways we could do this. We could, in a temporal network, we could couple temporally adjacent layers to one another. if the layers correspond to different connectivity modalities or different individuals, we could couple them categorically, so they're kind of an all-to-all, where all layers interact with one another. But if we do this, then occasionally it's the case where Q can actually increase if a particular node gets grouped into the same community across layers. I want to give you a brief example of how we might apply this to time-varying connectivity. So if we had time-varying networks, say, generated by sliding window methods, we would calculate the modularity matrices separately for each of our windows. Turns out it's a little more complicated for sign matrices. We have to be very careful about how we handle positive and negative connection weights and their transitive properties. I'm not going to get into the details here, but it's suffice to say it is possible. I'm going to skip this part, but we can create an intra-layer modularity matrix, one for each of the layers. This is an example of a temporal network. So we are going to add interlayer links between temporally adjacent windows only. And we have this final conundrum of choosing the weights of those interlayer links. If we make them very, very weak, we cluster this matrix, then the different layers are not particularly dependent upon one another. So the communities that we will detect will emphasize the unique modular structure of each layer. On the other hand, if we make the interlayer links very, very strong, the modules that we will detect will characterize the shared structure across layers, the shared communities. And all of the same challenges we saw with single layer modularity maximization apply here. We have to be careful about our null models. We have to deal with near degeneracies, and we also have to somehow deal with a resolution. So we don't skip those problems here. So what do the communities look like? Can we detect communities that say, or nodes rather, whose community assignments vary across layers? This is the so-called flexibility measure that some of you may be familiar with from Danny Bassett and her colleagues' work. So what we get back is something like this. So this shows us, this is from a much larger multi-layer network with something like 20 different layers. Each column here corresponds to a different layer, and the colors again denote community assignments. If we want to identify nodes whose communities are changing across time, we can literally compare the community assignments of nodes in successive layers. So here I'm showing you two layers from these communities. The blue elements indicate nodes whose community assignments have not changed. They are inflexible between those two layers, and the red nodes have changed. We can do this for all pairs of successive, all consecutive layers, and then average this to obtain what's called the flexibility measure. Each of these elements tell us across all pairs of layers, all consecutive layers, how often does a node change its community assignment. If we were to project these values back onto the cortical surface, we would get a map like this. We could repeat the algorithm, 100 times and get an average flexibility, which looks a little bit smoother and in some ways a little bit cleaner. We would get a pattern that might look like this. As I said before, measures like flexibility and the communities in general will depend on the interlayer coupling parameter, the weights of those interlayer links. So if those links are weak, we see lots of variation across time. On the other hand, if the interlayer coupling is strong, the weight's very, very large, there's much less variability because we're examining kind of a shared community structure across layers. So I am almost done. I have an interim slide and then a kind of additional reading slide. But a further summary, our modularity maximization technique is easily and readily extendable to multi-layer networks. There are some additional considerations, however, that are specific to the multi-layer case, including how we add interlayer couplings between pairs of layers, and then selecting their weights. These are challenges that we have to address anytime we use multi-layer modularity maximization. And of course, this multi-layer approach entails all of the same issues as before. Okay, so one final slide. Things that we didn't talk about. We did not talk about how to compare communities across individuals. We did not talk about comparisons against null models. It turns out that for certain classes of networks, even totally random networks, where the connections are formed truly at random, they can still exhibit high values of Q. So we didn't talk about that. We didn't talk in detail about how to choose the resolution parameter. It's something I didn't mention here in the slide, but we also didn't talk about how to effectively deal with matrices, connectivity matrices, where the weights represent statistical association, like a correlation matrix. We have to be very careful handling those with modularity maximization. Our null model in particular must be compatible with those transitive correlations. So there are lots of things. There's lots of further reading that we could discuss at some other time. But I also want to draw your attention to two specific issues. The first is an assumption baked into modularity maximization and also Infomap. But those tools assume that the communities in your network are what we call assortative. That is, that the communities are internally dense and externally sparse. That's this upper left-hand example. We get this kind of block diagonal structure. But there are other kinds of communities that you can observe in networks. Other kinds of meso-scale structure, including core periphery, so a densely connected core that projects onto a sparse periphery. You could have what we call disassorted or multipartite structure, where communities comprise of nodes that actively avoid connecting to one another or connecting internally, and they only connect to one another. Or we can have some mixture of the three, where some communities interact assortatively, others interact as cores and peripheries, and others interact disassortatively. It's possible to have all of these. So this is something, it's a limitation. It can be potentially or partially addressed with stochastic block models, but there are lots of limitations. There's lots of reasons to be skeptical about the communities that we get back from techniques like modularity maximization and Infomap. You're really shoehorning your data into a particular model of what constitutes a community. Another potentially more damning issue is the issue of that community detection itself, when we apply it to observational data, it is actually ill-posed. And it turns out there is no unique solution. There's no unique partition. It is universally optimal. What I mean by that is this. So what community detection is essentially doing is it imagines that there is some process, or some generative processes and networks that depend on these lowercase g's, these community assignments. And when we run this process, it gives rise to a network based on it has a certain set of nodes and a certain set of vertices. So it assumes that the networks we see, the generative process that underlies them, depends on nodes community assignments in some complicated way. I don't know what this function f is. What we are trying to do in community detection is invert this process. All we have access to is our observed network. And we are trying to invert this process to get to these G's, these lowercase g's, the communities themselves. However, doing this, there's an implicit specification. Rather, it requires that we specify, even implicitly, what that generative process is. Even if we don't admit to ourselves what we're doing, even if we don't write it in our papers, we are making guesses about what that generative process is. We do this by basing the methods that we choose. But this is a problem because it turns out there are many functions, many generative functions that map the same communities onto our network. So it may be the case that there are many functions, many generative processes that use the same communities to give rise to the same network that we see, but the processes themselves are very, very different. And alternatively, there may be many functions that use different communities, but give rise to the same network. That is, there's a many-to-one mapping of processes and communities to the same network. And unless we truly know the generative process that gave rise to our network, which we generally will not know for brain network data, then it is impossible, to unambiguously detect the true communities in your network, which motivates exploring many different tools, including block models and Infomap and modularity maximization, all side by side. So with that, I'm going to end. I'll note that we have a nice chapter in a book that came out on community detection and network neuroscience. The book came out in 2022, but the archive preprint is out on, it's been available since 2020. Just to revisit our initial goals, I think we succeeded in this in a lot of ways. We did not come up with a definitive roadmap for how to detect modules and communities in your network. Rather, we covered some of the challenges associated with this and exposed some of those challenges along the way. We talked about the decisions that we have to make, parameters that we have to choose. But ultimately, those decisions, though painful occasionally, the fact that we get to choose a null model, the fact that we get to choose the resolution parameter, the fact that we get to choose how to couple layers to one another, it makes tools like modularity maximization eminently flexible. Based on how we configure those tools, it can make modularity maximization and community detection algorithms more or less suitable for the problems and questions we're trying to address. So with that, this is a virtual talk, so I'm going to turn it over to questions. Hopefully I am here attending virtually and we can chat more. Otherwise, thank you for your time.